A white racist Karen called 911 when the black man next door changed the locks on his own house. She wanted a copy of his key, said it was a security issue, and when he told her he didn't owe her anything, she picked up her phone with trembling entitlement and dialed the number that could have changed his life forever. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about neighborhood watch. It was about control. And when she realized she couldn't have it, she tried to destroy him. What she didn't expect, what no one expected, was that the truth would come out. And when it did, the karma hit so hard, so fast, it left an entire community speechless. It started on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. Not even 5 minutes after the locksmith's truck pulled away from the curb, she was already in his driveway, her arms crossed, eyes sharp, and voice laced with fake concern. "Excuse me, but I noticed you changed the locks. We have a community rule about transparency. I'll need a copy of that new key. Just for safety." He looked at her, calm but clearly shocked, and asked her to repeat herself. She did. Louder this time. "I said I need a key. In case anything happens." He blinked. Shook his head. Said, "No. That's not happening." Then turned to walk inside. She grabbed her phone. Dialed 911. And told the operator a black man was breaking into a house that wasn't his. Within minutes, red and blue lights painted the driveway. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A few stepped onto porches. And there he was, standing on his own front lawn, hands up, surrounded by 2 armed officers, because a white woman didn't like being told no. The most heartbreaking part? This wasn't a surprise. He had seen the look since the day he moved in. The long stares when he checked his mailbox. The accidental trash can left blocking his driveway. The way she suddenly always walked her dog at the exact same time he came home from work. He had known something was coming. He just hadn't known it would be this calculated, this humiliating, and this dangerous. As the officers asked him for proof he lived there, she stood behind them, smirking. "You can check the locks. They were changed just today. I told you. He's not supposed to be here." One of the officers turned to her and asked, "And how do you know he doesn't live here?" She hesitated, then answered, "Because I know everyone in this neighborhood. And I've never seen him before this week." He interrupted. Calmly. "That's funny. Because I've been living here for 3 months. You waved at me the day I moved in. You even offered me banana bread." The smirk vanished. The officers looked between them. One of them asked him to unlock the door. He did. Without hesitation. Walked inside. Brought out a framed deed with his name on it. Showed utility bills. Showed ID. It was his house. No question. And for a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it. But then, one of the officers turned back to her. Something in her expression had shifted. Gone was the innocent concern. In its place, a cold, tight-lipped panic. The officer asked her for her ID. She hesitated. Fumbled. Said she left it at home. He asked again. More firmly. And that's when the story began to unravel. Because she didn't own the house next door. She wasn't on the lease. She wasn't even supposed to be living there. The real owners had filed for eviction months ago, said the previous tenant had moved out, but someone had broken in. Changed the mailbox. Switched the locks. She had been squatting there illegally ever since. The neighbors hadn't known because she acted like she belonged. Because she played the role so well, lawn mowed, porch swept, cookies at HOA meetings. But the moment she tried to call the police on an innocent man, she opened the door to scrutiny. And scrutiny revealed everything. In the days that followed, the story went viral. His calm, his dignity, his refusal to be baited, it all stood in stark contrast to her lies. The footage from a neighbor's Ring camera caught the entire thing. Including her smug expression when the cops arrived. Including the way she lied with confidence. And including the moment her face fell when she realized she was the one being questioned. He didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to prove her wrong. The truth did it for him. But what makes this story unforgettable isn't just the humiliation she brought on herself. It's what the police discovered when they looked deeper. Because what they found changes everything. It goes far beyond a false 911 call. It goes beyond racial profiling, beyond entitlement. It reaches into theft, deception, and a level of manipulation no one saw coming. So the question is, what did they find inside her house? And how did that discovery turn her entire world upside down? That's where the Real story begins. And once you hear it, you'll never forget it. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. If you're a black viewer, know this: your life, your voice, and your story matter. We believe in equality, dignity, and the power of truth to bring justice. This story is a reflection of what too many have faced, but also a reminder that karma can be powerful and justice can come when least expected. Enjoy the story. And if this message resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to help us share more stories that matter. The neighborhood of Eastbrook was the kind of place that tried too hard to feel perfect. Wide sidewalks, evenly spaced trees, white fences that never needed paint, and a homeowners association that met more often than most families had dinner together. It was nestled just outside of Richmond, Virginia, far enough from the city noise to feel peaceful, but close enough that the buzz of ambition and progress was still in the air. To most of its residents, Eastbrook was a bubble of control, structure, and saneness. To others, it was a tightly wound clock of tension, ticking just beneath the surface. And for one man, a quiet, determined, black man named Malik Johnson, Eastbrook was supposed to be a new beginning. Malik was 34 years old, a software engineer by profession, and a problem solver by instinct. He had grown up in Atlanta, the youngest of 3 boys raised by a single mother who worked night shifts at a hospital and never once let them feel the absence of a father. His life was built on discipline, persistence, and the quiet kind of confidence that doesn't need to be shouted. After years of climbing the professional ladder, he had finally landed a remote tech lead position, which allowed him to move anywhere he wanted. He chose Richmond for its blend of history, culture, and opportunity, but he chose Eastbrook because he thought it would give him something more elusive: peace. The house he bought was modest, but elegant. A 2-bedroom colonial with a small backyard and a front porch that caught the morning light just right. It was the kind of place you could hear your own thoughts. The kind of place you could build something. He saw it not just as a home, but as a symbol of everything he had worked for. It was stability, legacy, pride. What he didn't know, or maybe didn't want to admit at first, was that to some of the people already living there, a man like him owning a house like that didn't fit the story they told themselves about who belonged. Karen Whitmore lived next door. Late 40s. Divorced. No children. She claimed she was a consultant for a real estate firm, but no one ever really saw her working. She kept her yard immaculate, hosted wine nights with the other white women on the block, and had a strange habit of monitoring the street from her window as if she had been assigned security detail. She smiled often, but it never reached her eyes. In a place like Eastbrook, Karen had built a reputation as the self-proclaimed guardian of the standard. She remembered everyone's trash pickup schedule, reported every improperly parked car, and had memorized the community bylaws down to the punctuation. At first, Malik tried to keep things neutral. He introduced himself on day one, polite, professional, respectful. She smiled back, offered a slice of banana bread, and complimented his car. For a brief moment, he thought maybe he had misjudged her. But small things began to add up. She forgot to tell him about HOA meetings. She once suggested he paint his front door a different color, to match the rest of the homes. She called animal control when a stray cat sat on his porch for too long, claiming it was a potential health risk. Malik never argued, never pushed back. He knew the unspoken rules of navigating spaces not built with you in mind. But he also knew something else: silence does not equal submission. Despite the awkwardness, Malik focused on building his life. He had recently ended a long-term relationship, and the new house was part of his reset. He started running in the mornings, cooking more, even planting vegetables in the backyard. He joined virtual meetups for local black professionals and volunteered at a coding program for teens on weekends. He was the kind of neighbor who brought in packages for people when they were out of town, waved at everyone, kept his music low. He wasn't just fitting in, he was enriching the community, though most of them chose not to see it. The old lock on his front door had been sticking for weeks. Malik had meant to replace it sooner, but with work deadlines and life's usual interruptions, it got pushed down the list. Until the day it jammed completely, and he had to crawl through the back window just to get inside. That was the final straw. He called a locksmith, scheduled the job, and took a day off to handle it. It was nothing out of the ordinary. In any other neighborhood, it would have been a non-event. But in Eastbrook, with eyes that never stopped watching and judgments always waiting to be made, it became something else entirely. When the locksmith arrived, Karen was already outside, pretending to water plants that didn't need it. She lingered on her porch, eyes narrowed, lips tight. Malik acknowledged her with a nod. She didn't nod back. He shrugged it off. The job took less than 30 minutes. New lock installed. New keys handed over. The moment the locksmith left, she crossed the yard, not with curiosity, but with entitlement. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She simply spoke. Calm, assertive, with the same voice one might use to order a latte. She told him she'd need a copy of the new key. Just in case of emergency, she said, as if the absurdity of the request didn't register. Malik stood there, holding the key in his hand, trying to decide if he had heard her correctly. When he realized she was serious, he chuckled. Not to mock her, but because the audacity of the demand was so wild it bordered on parody. He told her no. Respectfully, firmly. Just no. She blinked. Tilted her head. Tried again, this time invoking community safety and protocol. He didn't argue. He simply turned and walked back toward his door. That's when she made the call. The moment her voice hit the 911 dispatcher's ear, she turned herself into the victim. Said a strange man was tampering with a property he doesn't own. Claimed he looked aggressive, that she was afraid for her safety. She painted herself as the concerned neighbor trying to protect the block, when in truth, she was the threat. Malik didn't hear the call. But he saw her watching him from her porch, phone still in hand, eyes cold. He felt it, that invisible weight of being targeted not for what you've done, but for who you are. When the police pulled up 10 minutes later, Malik was inside, cleaning up tools and tossing packaging into the recycling. He looked out the window and saw 2 squad cars. Then saw her. Standing on her lawn, pointing. Gesturing. The next moments unfolded with grim familiarity. The knock on the door. The questions. The request for identification. All delivered politely, but with the edge of assumption. He complied. Spoke calmly. Showed ID. Showed proof of ownership. The officers nodded, but kept looking at him like maybe there was still something off. Like maybe the story didn't add up, even when all the facts were right in front of them. And she watched. Still standing there. Still holding on to the fantasy that her version of events could overwrite the truth. Malik kept his composure. He had been here before, not in exact detail, but in feeling. That tightness in the chest. The awareness of every movement. The knowledge that one wrong word, one twitch of impatience, could change everything. And still, he stood tall. Calm. certain. Not because he wasn't angry. But because he knew who he was, and no false narrative could shake that. Eventually, the officers returned to her. Started asking questions. Started noticing details. Her answers didn't come as quickly. Her smile faltered. But that's where the surface of the story ends, and the cracks beneath it begin to show. Because something didn't feel right to them. Something about her reactions. Her defensiveness. Her insistence. And when they looked closer, when they asked the right questions and pulled the right threads, the truth they uncovered would turn the entire neighborhood on its head. But that truth isn't ready just yet. The real question is, what was Karen hiding? And why, after trying so hard to humiliate someone else, was she the one who ended up exposed? When the officers left that afternoon, nothing had changed on the surface. The sky was still clear, the street still quiet, and neighbors still peeked through half-closed blinds pretending not to stare. But something in the air had shifted. Malik felt it. A ripple of unease, a murmur under every polite smile that suddenly carried a different weight. He had thought the worst was over once he proved he owned his home, but what lingered was heavier than accusation. It was the aftertaste of suspicion, like the smell of smoke after a fire that never quite burned through. And as he stood on his porch that evening, watching Karen water her perfectly trimmed hedge like nothing had happened, something inside him hardened. That night, he didn't sleep. He replayed the entire event in his mind, every word, every look, every hesitation in the officer's voice. He remembered the way she spoke with conviction, how easily she twisted the narrative into something that felt almost believable. That was what haunted him the most, how close she came to rewriting his truth, right in front of him. He had heard of stories like this. He had read them. Watched them go viral. But living it, feeling that silent threat wrap around your life like a noose, was something else entirely. It changed him. Not in anger. But in resolve. The next morning, Malik sat at his kitchen table with a notebook open. He wasn't plotting revenge. That wasn't his nature. But he needed to understand. Something in her behavior didn't make sense. Her entitlement, sure, he had seen that before, but the desperation in her voice when the officers asked for her ID, the way she avoided answering direct questions, the tension in her shoulders as they lingered on her property a little longer than expected, it was more than just prejudice. It was fear. And fear, he knew, was rarely baseless. Days passed. Karen didn't bring it up. Not directly. But there were moments. Subtle comments tossed in the air like harmless chatter that always carried a sharp edge. At the community meeting held on Friday evening, which she had made sure he knew about this time, she casually mentioned the importance of vetting homeowners before they move in. She smiled when she said it, but her eyes never met his. Another neighbor asked if everything was okay between them, and she responded with a breathy laugh, "Oh, I'm fine. But some people bring a different energy, you know." Malik didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew what she was doing, planting seeds. Quietly poisoning the well. But what she didn't realize was that Malik wasn't alone. That night, he received a message from a neighbor named Elena, a young Latina woman who lived 2 doors down. She had seen the entire event through her window, and more importantly, her Ring camera had captured part of the interaction between Karen and the police. She asked if he wanted a copy. Said she didn't like what she saw, and something about it felt wrong. Malik thanked her, and for the first time since the incident, he felt a spark of validation. He reviewed the footage carefully. Watched as Karen gestured wildly, pointing at his house, her voice rising just enough to catch the microphones. There was a moment, one that struck him deeply, where she turned to the officer and said, "Trust me, he doesn't live there. I've been here for 10 years. I know this neighborhood like the back of my hand." It was more than just a lie. It was a performance. A calculated attempt to assert dominance, to rewrite his reality in real time. And the scariest part? She almost pulled it off. The footage was damning. Malik wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but knowing he had it gave him a sense of power he hadn't felt in days. That same night, he received another message, this time from Andre, an older black man who lived one street over. Andre had been in Eastbrook for nearly 2 decades, and while he mostly kept to himself, he'd always been observant. He said he heard about what happened and wanted to talk. They met the next afternoon at a small park nearby, a quiet place where retired folks walked their dogs and read books in the shade. Andre didn't waste time. You know she did the same thing to a guy who rented that house before you, right? Malik blinked. What do you mean? Andre leaned back on the bench, arms crossed. Young brother, mid-20s. Moved in with his fiancée. Nice couple. She called the police on them twice. Said they were having parties. Said they smelled like weed. They barely lasted 6 weeks before breaking the lease. She told the HOA they were a danger to the community. Malik felt something cold settle in his chest. And nobody did anything. Andre shrugged. Most people here just don't want to get involved. They think keeping the peace means staying silent. That conversation stayed with Malik. He started connecting the dots, subtle at first, but undeniable once seen. Karen had a pattern. Not just of being difficult or entitled, but of targeting anyone who didn't fit her vision of the neighborhood. She wore her prejudice like perfume, not always overpowering, but always present. And the more Malik looked into her past, the more disturbing the picture became. Through some research, he discovered that the property records for Karen's house were complicated. The address was listed under a family trust, one that hadn't been updated in years. The listed tenant had moved out 9 months ago, and court filings showed that an eviction notice had been issued but never resolved. The name Karen Whitmore appeared nowhere in the legal documents. That's when the pieces began to fall into place. She didn't own that house. She wasn't renting it either. She was living there illegally, likely using her proximity to other neighbors and her overconfidence to create the illusion of legitimacy. He shared this with Elena, who was stunned. Wait, so she's not even supposed to be here? Malik nodded. If what I'm seeing is right, she's been squatting next door. Probably keeping the mailbox full, pretending to be the old tenant. It's why she panicked when the cops asked for her ID. Elena leaned forward. Are you going to report her? Malik exhaled slowly. Not yet. I want to be sure. I want to be smart. What followed was a slow, deliberate investigation. Malik began keeping a record of everything, photos of Karen's comings and goings, notes from neighbors who shared their own encounters with her, even screenshots from community message boards where she made veiled comments about outsiders lowering property values. Each piece added to the puzzle, but it was the phone call from an anonymous number that changed everything. The voice on the line was low, cautious. The man identified himself only as someone who used to work with Karen in a real estate office 5 years ago. He said she had a history of unethical behavior, using insider access to delay evictions, hiding in vacant properties to avoid legal paperwork, even creating fake leases to justify her presence. She knows how to work the system, he said. But if you push in the right places, it all falls apart. Malik hung up with his heart pounding. Everything made sense now. She wasn't just racist. She was a manipulator. A con artist. And she had built her entire facade on a foundation of lies. The final push came unexpectedly. Malik received an email from the actual property owners of Karen's house, a middle-aged couple from out of state who had been trying to get her out for months. They saw a local blog post referencing the police incident, recognized the address, and reached out. We've never heard of a Karen Whitmore, they wrote. She was never a legal tenant. If you have any information that could help, we'd appreciate it. He had more than information. He had evidence. He had community support. He had enough to bring down everything she had built on deception. But before he could take the next step, something happened. Something no one could have predicted. And what came next, changed everything. Because when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about what she had been hiding, inside that house, and why the police, once they returned, didn't just question her. They arrested her. But what did they find? And why did it leave the entire neighborhood speechless? That answer is coming. It was a Thursday morning when everything finally snapped into motion, quiet at first, like a storm still miles away but charging fast. The sun had just started warming the lawns of Eastbrook when two unmarked cars pulled up slowly at the end of the street. They parked with intention, not urgency, like they already knew what they were about to find. Malik watched from his window, coffee in hand, heart steady. He didn't feel victorious. He felt grounded, like a man who had carried a weight for too long and was finally about to set it down. He wasn't hoping for revenge. He wanted resolution. Truth laid bare, without distortion. And when he saw two officers step out, one of them the same man who had questioned him weeks ago, he knew, this wasn't routine. This was reckoning. They approached Karen's house slowly, knocking firmly but not with force. She opened the door without hesitation, still in her robe, hair curled, expression composed but flat. She didn't greet them. Just waited. One officer handed her a folded paper. Malik couldn't hear the words, but he saw the shift in her face, not panic, but something colder. Something that looked like resignation. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She stepped aside and let them in. Minutes passed. 5. Then 10. Then nearly 20 before the door opened again, and one of the officers emerged with a large black bag in hand, followed by another holding a small box filled with documents. Behind them, Karen was escorted out, not in handcuffs, not yet, but with her wrists held lightly by the officer's hands, as if already rehearsing the posture. Her face was no longer composed. It was vacant. Pale. As if whatever they had said to her inside had cut through every layer of performance she'd built. Malik stepped outside, drawn by something he couldn't name. She saw him immediately. Their eyes locked. And for the first time, her expression cracked. Not in anger. Not in arrogance. But in something else entirely, humiliation. She tried to speak, lips parted, then closed again. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just watched. Because he didn't need to say anything. The truth was already doing the work. Later that day, Malik received a call from Officer Ramos, the same one who had asked for his ID the day she accused him. This time, his tone was different. Less guarded. Almost apologetic. "We executed a warrant this morning," Ramos said, voice low, careful. "We found forged documents. Lease papers with signatures that don't match the original owners, tampered mailbox labels, and evidence of long-term squatting. But that's not even the worst of it." Malik sat in silence, waiting. There was also a storage bin in the attic. "We found hundreds of personal documents, bank statements, social security cards, IDs. None of them hers. All stolen from previous tenants in other neighborhoods. She's been moving through properties like this for years. Staying just long enough to avoid detection, manipulating neighbors, faking leases. She uses the HOA and community events to blend in. But this time, she pushed too far." Malik felt his fingers tighten around the edge of the table. "She has a history of exploiting systemic bias. She picks neighborhoods where her face gives her credibility, then targets people she thinks won't push back. You weren't the first. But you were the first to document everything. That changed everything." He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the window, not really seeing anything. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "What happens now? She's being charged with felony identity theft, fraud, unlawful occupancy, and filing a false police report. There may be more, depending on what the DA finds. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. And I'm sorry for how that first day went. Malik nodded, even though the officer couldn't see him. He appreciated the call, but the apology landed in a place too deep for quick repair. 2 days later, a town hall was called. Not by Karen, but by the HOA president, who had gone suspiciously silent since the arrest. The meeting was packed. Neighbors who hadn't said a word to Malik in weeks suddenly looked him in the eye. Some nodded. Some didn't. The room buzzed with guilt disguised as curiosity. And when Malik stood to speak, the room went quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He told the truth. About what had happened. About how close it had come to something far worse. About the silence that had protected her. And about the need for that silence to end. When he was done, no one clapped. But no one interrupted either. And that silence, for once, felt like acknowledgement. After the meeting, Elena found him outside, her arms crossed against the cold air. "You did it," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No. She did it to herself. I just refused to stay quiet." She smiled, soft but tired. "There's more people like her out there." "Yeah," he said, looking toward his house. "But there's more people like us too." That night, Malik sat on his porch as the wind moved through the trees. He thought of his mother. Of the lessons she taught him about dignity, about walking through fire without burning. He thought of how close he came to losing everything over a lie. And how, in the end, the lie unraveled on its own weight. But something still lingered. A question. Not about her, but about what would have happened if he hadn't stayed calm. If he hadn't kept records. If he hadn't been quiet when everything in him screamed to react. And he knew that question didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to every person who had ever been forced to prove they deserved to exist peacefully in their own space. Every person who had been told, without words, "You don't belong here." But now, Eastbrook knew the truth. And it would never forget it. 2 days after the town hall meeting, the air in Eastbrook still felt heavy, like the tension hadn't quite lifted, only settled into a new shape. The neighborhood was quieter than usual. Lawns were trimmed, porches swept, but the usual forced smiles and neighborly waves were absent. Malik noticed the stillness, the way voices dropped when he walked by, the way doors seemed to close a second too fast. It didn't bother him. Not anymore. What he had uncovered, what he had endured, changed the way he walked through the world. Not with arrogance, but with unshakable certainty, not just in himself, but in the value of standing up when it would have been easier to disappear. That morning, he received a call from the property owners again. They were flying into Richmond to finalize the case against Karen, and they wanted to meet him personally. Malik agreed, curious to put faces to the names he had seen only in emails. They met at a small cafe downtown, a modest place with brick walls and warm lighting. The couple, Mark and Angela Patterson, were in their early 50s, kind, apologetic, and clearly shaken by everything that had happened. They expressed deep gratitude, not just for his patience, but for his diligence in uncovering the truth. Malik listened, nodded, accepted their thanks, but kept his emotions guarded. There was still something unsettled in him, a part that hadn't yet found closure. Back in Eastbrook, word spread quickly that Karen had been denied bail. The judge cited her history of fraud, her flight risk, and the serious nature of her identity theft charges. Elena texted him updates as they came in, her messages short but packed with disbelief. "She's not getting out," one read. "They found more victims in other counties." Another one followed, hours later. "The news is running it tonight. You should watch." Malik didn't want to. He wasn't sure he could stomach seeing her face again, hearing her voice twisted into a soundbite. But curiosity won. He turned on the television and sat in silence as the segment aired. There she was. Karen Whitmore, in grainy mugshot video, no longer the queen of the HOA, no longer the enforcer of imaginary rules, but a woman exposed. The anchor recounted the crimes, false leases, multiple instances of squatting, dozens of fake identities recovered from her belongings. But it was the footage from that first day, the Ring camera clip of her calling 911, that hit hardest. Watching it from the outside, hearing her voice paint him as a threat, watching her body language so convincingly fabricate fear, it stirred something in him that hadn't fully surfaced before. A mix of rage and sorrow. A grief for how easily his life could have been destroyed if just one thing had gone differently. The following week, a civil rights organization reached out. They had seen the story. They wanted to talk. Not about publicity, but about policy. Malik hesitated, but agreed to a meeting. He didn't want attention. He wanted change. When he walked into their office, a modest building tucked behind a library downtown, he was met by a group of lawyers, community leaders, and advocates who had read every detail. They asked questions. Listened carefully. And when they were done, they asked him if he'd be willing to testify, not just against Karen, but in front of the State Housing Board, to push for legislation that would close the loopholes people like her use to exploit the system. Malik sat quietly, letting the weight of the offer settle. "I'm not a politician," he said finally, voice low but steady. "I'm just a man who wanted to live in peace." One of the attorneys leaned forward, nodding. "Exactly. That's what makes your voice matter." Malik looked down at his hands, the scars invisible but deeply etched. He thought of his mother, her words still guiding him even from afar. He thought of every person who had been forced to keep their head down, who had lost jobs, homes, dignity over lies wrapped in polite language. And he thought about Karen, not just her fall, but her face when the truth finally cracked through her carefully built world. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "But not for me. For the next person she would have targeted. For the people who never got to speak." Days blurred into weeks. Malik returned to his routines, work, running, volunteering, but nothing felt quite the same. He noticed every glance a little longer. Heard every coded phrase more sharply. The world hadn't changed overnight, but his awareness had. Elena stopped by more often, sometimes with food, sometimes with updates. They didn't always talk about Karen. Sometimes they talked about music, childhood, what made them feel safe. One evening, she asked him what it felt like, not to be vindicated, but to have everyone finally see what he had seen all along. He paused before answering. "It feels like I'm breathing again," he said. "But slower. Like my lungs forgot how to trust the air." She nodded slowly, letting the words hang between them. "You think people will treat you different now?" "I don't know," he said. "But I don't care the same way I used to. I don't need them to approve. Just to respect the fact that I belong." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need to be filled. One afternoon, weeks later, Malik received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. The handwriting was tight, almost hesitant. Inside was a single page. No apology. No denial. Just a sentence. "I never thought you'd be the one who stopped me." There was no signature. But he didn't need one. He folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and didn't look at it again. That same week, he got word that the board hearing was scheduled. He would testify alongside the property owners, the attorney, and two others who had come forward with stories of their own. One had nearly lost custody of their child after a false accusation of drug use in a rental home where Karen had squatted before. Another had spent months trying to rebuild credit after she opened a credit card in his name. Their stories were different, but the thread was the same, a woman who moved through the system like a shadow, always confident the rules wouldn't catch her. The night before the hearing, Malik stood on his porch again. The sky was clear. The street was still. He thought about everything, the false smile on her face that first day, the way she had stood on his lawn like it was hers, the moment her story collapsed under the weight of evidence. He thought about how easily he could have been erased. And how hard it had been to stay still, stay calm, stay honest in a situation designed to rob him of all three. And for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. Not because she was gone, but because he was still here. And louder than ever. What came next wouldn't be easy. But it would be real. And this time, the whole city would be watching. The day of the State Housing Board hearing arrived beneath a gray sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Malik stood outside the tall glass building downtown, his reflection staring back at him in the entrance doors. He didn't feel nervous, not in the usual sense, but a strange mixture of clarity and weight. His story wasn't just his anymore. It was now part of a broader conversation, one that had pulled in the voices of people who had once stayed silent, either out of fear, fatigue, or disbelief that speaking up would matter. The moment he stepped through the building's doors, he wasn't just a neighbor or a homeowner. He was a witness. A voice tied to a storm that had shaken an entire community awake. Inside, the room was colder than he expected. Rows of chairs, most of them filled, faced a long table of board members with stern expressions and tired eyes. On one side sat the Pattersons, quiet but alert. Beside them, two other victims who had traveled from different counties, each carrying documents, photos, and emotions still raw. Malik took his seat and scanned the room. There were cameras in the back, a few reporters with notepads, and even a few neighbors from Eastbrook who had come out of what they called support, but whose curiosity was unmistakable. Still, he didn't care about the audience. He focused on why he was there. When his name was called, Malik stood, straightened his shoulders, and walked to the front. The board chair, an older black woman with kind but piercing eyes, invited him to speak. He began not with the events themselves, but with the feeling, what it's like to be questioned in your own home, to be told with a smile that you're a threat, to live surrounded by manicured lawns and forced civility that hides the rot underneath. He spoke plainly, without theatrics, but with a conviction that landed heavy in the room. He explained how Karen manipulated systems meant to protect, how her lies weren't just personal, they were strategic. And he described the quiet damage done by complicity, how silence becomes another layer of harm when people choose comfort over accountability. After he finished, there was a long pause. One of the board members leaned forward and asked, "What would justice look like for you?" Malik thought about that. The question wasn't easy. Justice wasn't just about charges or headlines. It was about safety. Restoration. The right to exist without having to explain your existence. So, he answered, carefully but firmly. He said justice looked like structural change, like laws that protect the vulnerable instead of enabling predators. Like systems that investigate false claims with the same urgency they respond to real danger. Like a neighborhood learning how to see without suspicion. After the testimonies ended, the board deliberated. No decision would be made public that day, but everyone in that room knew a shift had occurred. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. And as Malik left the building, his footsteps felt lighter than they had in weeks. Not because it was over, but because it was finally moving forward. In the days that followed, Eastbrook was a neighborhood in transition. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors now spilled out during walks, in driveways, over mailboxes. Some people avoided him altogether, embarrassed or unwilling to confront what his presence now represented. Others offered nods, quiet acknowledgments that held more meaning than words. And then there were those like Mr. Harris, a Vietnam veteran who lived 2 houses down, who walked over one morning with coffee and said, "I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm sorry, son. You didn't deserve that." Malik didn't need apologies, but he accepted them. Not out of obligation, but because growth demanded grace. And grace, unlike forgiveness, wasn't about forgetting. It was about recognizing the space between who people are and who they could become if they chose to see the truth. Then, one afternoon, he received another letter. This one came from the district attorney's office. Inside was a formal notice, Karen had officially been charged with multiple counts of identity fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. The evidence recovered from her residence, combined with testimonies from her victims, had built a case strong enough to go to trial. Malik held the letter for a long time, his mind quiet. It wasn't about celebration. It was about something deeper, an affirmation that even when the system feels broken, it can still respond when pushed hard enough by truth. That night, he stood on his back porch, the breeze moving through the garden he had almost abandoned. The tomatoes were growing again, vines reaching for the wooden stakes he had tied with careful knots. It reminded him of something his mother once said, "Even when people try to bury you, they forget you're a seed." He whispered it aloud, smiling to himself. Not because the pain was gone, but because the growth was undeniable. A week later, a city newspaper ran a feature titled, "When the System Fails, the People Rise." Malik's photo was in the corner, not posed, just candid, taken during the hearing as he stood at the podium. The article recounted his journey, the legal changes now being proposed, and the stories of others who had come forward. His inbox filled with messages from strangers. Some thanking him. Some sharing their own experiences. A man from Texas. A woman from Indiana. A couple from Brooklyn. Each message different, but echoing the same core, "This happened to me too. I didn't think anyone would believe me." And yet, not all responses were kind. Some questioned his motives. Accused him of seeking attention. Said Karen was just misunderstood. Malik read them all. Not to absorb the hate, but to remind himself of what was still left to do. Because for every voice lifted in solidarity, there was still another clinging to denial. And that denial didn't scare him, it motivated him. Because he knew who he was. And he had earned the right to take up space without permission. Elena stopped by that evening, bringing over a tray of lemon bars she'd baked herself. They sat on the porch again, the sun low, casting soft light across the street. She asked him if he'd read the article. He nodded, tapping the corner of the paper folded beside him. "I didn't expect them to call it that," he said. "But I guess it fits." She leaned back, sipping her drink. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't changed the lock that day?" He stared out across the lawn, mind tracing 1,000 what-ifs. "Yeah," he said. "All the time. But I don't think about it with fear anymore. I think about how close we all live to silence. And how sometimes, doing something ordinary, like changing a lock, can end up shaking everything loose." They stayed outside long after the sun disappeared, not needing to say much more. The silence between them was no longer the kind that came from tension, but the kind that held understanding. A shared knowing that something had shifted in both their lives. In the neighborhood. In how they chose to carry themselves forward. And still, Malik wasn't done. The trial was coming. Karen would face not just evidence, but consequence. And the entire process would be public. Transparent. Real. For once, the weight of truth would not be his to bear alone. But even with that on the horizon, he faced a deeper, more personal question, one he hadn't answered yet. Now that justice was in motion, what would he do with his voice? Would he return to quiet? Or would he use what he had lived through to shape something larger than himself? That question echoed louder than any verdict. Because while Karen's chapter was closing, Malik's was just beginning. And the world was watching. Weeks passed, and the buzz around the case began to settle into the deeper, steadier rhythm of consequence. Malik had grown used to the occasional stares at the grocery store, the quiet nods from people who recognized him from the newspaper article or the local news segment. He didn't crave the attention, but he didn't hide from it either. He had become a reluctant symbol, not of victory, but of resilience, a man who stood still while a storm tried to knock him down, and now carried the responsibility of what that meant. But as the court date for Karen's trial drew closer, something more complicated stirred beneath the surface. It wasn't fear. It wasn't satisfaction. It was a kind of emotional ache, one he hadn't named before. A quiet struggle between what had happened to him, what he had done in response, and what it now demanded of him moving forward. One evening, while sitting on his porch again with Elena, he brought it up in a voice so casual she almost missed the weight of it at first. He asked her if she ever felt guilty for being part of someone else's downfall, even when they had earned it. She looked at him, surprised, then softened. She told him the truth. Yes, she had. Not because she wished she hadn't done the right thing, but because doing the right thing doesn't always feel clean. Sometimes it leaves you bruised, even when you're the one who's been wronged. He nodded slowly, grateful that she didn't dismiss the question, didn't try to give him a packaged answer. The truth lived in the gray. And Malik had spent so long surviving in a black and white world that the gray felt disorienting, even now. That night, he sat at his kitchen table and reopened the drawer where he had stored the handwritten letter from Karen. The one with that single, loaded sentence, "I never thought you'd be the one who stopped me." He stared at it for a long time, then unfolded it again. He read the words not with anger, but with an unfamiliar sadness. Not for her actions, but for what had led her to believe she could keep getting away with them. For how long she had lived that lie, and how many people she had convinced to look the other way. He thought about the first day they met, how she smiled like someone who had already measured him, already decided what box to put him in. And then he remembered the way she looked when the officers took her away, not angry, not defiant, but hollow. Like the structure she'd spent years building inside herself had finally collapsed, and there was nothing left behind it but dust. He knew he would testify again during the trial, but this time it would be different. This time it wouldn't be about proving anything to anyone, it would be about documenting truth, sealing a chapter that had defined so much of his life without his permission. He met with the district attorney a week before the trial, reviewing the evidence once more, rehearsing what would be asked. The DA, a sharp but empathetic woman named Renee Thomas, had been with the case from the start. She had fought hard to bring it to court and was determined to see it through to the end. During the meeting, she looked across the table at Malik and asked him if he was ready. He told her he was. But then he paused and asked her something he hadn't asked anyone yet. He wanted to know what kind of sentence Karen might face. Renee leaned back, her hands clasped. She explained that while the charges were serious, felony fraud, identity theft, obstruction, the actual time served could vary. There might be a plea deal. There might be leniency based on mental health evaluations. She didn't sugarcoat it. She may not serve as much time as people expect, she said. Malik nodded slowly. But the truth came out. That has to matter. Renee nodded back. It does. More than you know. But justice isn't always measured in years behind bars. Sometimes it's what the world learns because of the trial. What changes after? The courtroom was smaller than Malik expected. Intimate. The kind of room where everyone can hear a breath catch or a foot shuffle. Karen was there, seated beside her lawyer, wearing a plain gray suit that made her look smaller than he remembered. Her hair was pinned back tightly, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at him once. But he looked at her, not with hate, not even with contempt, but with the clarity of someone who had seen too much to pretend he hadn't. When he was called to the stand, he walked slowly, deliberately. He took his seat. Swore in. And began. He told the story again, but this time with more distance. Not because he felt detached, but because the pain wasn't raw anymore, it was structured now, like a scar that had healed over but still ached in the cold. He described the incident with precision, the timeline, the aftermath. He explained the feeling of being disbelieved in real time, of being treated like a suspect in a life he had built with sweat and intention. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. When it was Karen's turn to speak, something unexpected happened. Her voice trembled. She spoke slowly, carefully, clearly coached but still shaken. She didn't deny what she had done. Her lawyer framed it as delusion, a psychological unraveling triggered by trauma, by abandonment, by fear. But Malik didn't hear fear in her words. He heard control. The same tone she had used that day in the driveway, dressed now in softer language. She said she thought she was protecting the neighborhood. She said she misunderstood. That she didn't mean harm. But there was one moment, a flicker in her eyes, when she looked toward the gallery of people watching and said, "I didn't think anyone would care this much." That sentence hung in the room like fog. Malik's hands tensed in his lap. Not out of anger. But because that line, so small, so seemingly benign, revealed the core of everything. She hadn't thought anyone would care. Because no one had cared before. Because no one had stopped her. Because systems had protected her, and silence had shielded her, and comfort had let her believe her actions didn't count. But they did. After closing arguments, the courtroom emptied slowly. The verdict wouldn't come for a few days. Malik walked outside into the daylight, the sky a clean blue that stretched wide over the city. Elena was waiting near the courthouse steps, arms folded, sunglasses pushing her hair back. She didn't speak at first. Just walked beside him for a while, matching his pace. Then she asked, how did it feel, hearing her say that? He didn't answer right away. He waited until they reached the corner where the noise of traffic gave them cover. Then he said, it felt like a mirror. Not of me. Of everything that makes this country what it is. She looked at him, confused. What do you mean? I mean people like her are shaped by what we ignore. What we excuse. What we don't talk about because it's easier not to. And when you finally hold that up to the light, you don't just see her. You see all the cracks in the walls we've been pretending are solid. Elena nodded, biting her bottom lip. So what now? Malik stopped walking. Looked at her. Then looked past her, to the city moving around them. Now, he said, we keep building. From the truth. Not the silence. The words didn't feel final. They felt like a beginning. And even though the trial wasn't over, the impact already was. The message had landed. The ripples had spread. Karen would face the legal system, but Malik had already changed the moral one. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't surviving the system. He was reshaping it. The days following the trial were strange, suspended in a kind of quiet tension where everything had been said but nothing had yet been decided. Malik returned to his life cautiously, like someone learning how to walk again after an accident. The neighborhood looked the same, but the energy had shifted. Some people kept their distance still, unsure of how to approach him, while others who had remained invisible before now offered kind gestures, homemade bread, quick nods from passing cars, handwritten notes slipped into his mailbox that simply said, "Thank you." He didn't need their apologies or their validation, but it reminded him that change doesn't always roar, it whispers. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the deepest weight. Each morning, he opened his email to new messages, some from local reporters still following the story, others from civil rights groups requesting interviews or support. But it was the messages from ordinary people that struck him hardest. One from a high school student in Chicago who wrote, "Your story gave me courage to speak up when I was treated unfairly in class." Another from an older black veteran who said, "I wish I had your strength when it happened to me back in the 70s. These messages didn't feel like praise. They felt like shared survival. Like a long, invisible thread connecting generations of people who had been silenced, doubted, or ignored, and who now saw in Malik not just a man who had endured injustice, but one who had confronted it with dignity. One afternoon, Elena invited Malik over for dinner. Her house felt warm, filled with the smell of roasted garlic and soft music playing low in the background. As they ate, she asked if he'd heard anything more from the DA's office. He shook his head. The verdict was due soon, but the silence in between had grown heavier. "I keep thinking about that moment," Elena said, sipping her wine, when she said she didn't think anyone would care. "I still can't shake it." Malik looked down at his plate, then back at her. Because she meant it. That wasn't a defense. That was her truth. She genuinely believed no one would stop her. Elena nodded slowly. It makes me wonder how many other people believe that. How many are out there doing the same thing, just waiting for no one to look. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of that question settle in. Then Malik spoke, his voice soft but firm. We can't look away anymore. Not just from the big things, but the small ones too. The jokes people let slide. The assumptions no one corrects. The fear that walks into rooms before we do and decides for everyone else how we should be treated. It all matters. It all builds to this. Elena leaned forward. So what do we do about it? Malik didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, watching the evening light stretch across the floor. We keep speaking. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when no one claps. We make the truth so loud it can't be ignored. The following day, Malik received a call from Renee Thomas. The verdict had been reached. He was to appear in court the next morning for the reading. He hung up and sat still, the room around him silent except for the low hum of his refrigerator. This was the final moment of a chapter that had begun with a lock and a lie, and ended with a courtroom full of people forced to reckon with the truth. That night, he barely slept. Not because he was afraid of the outcome, but because he couldn't stop thinking about what this would mean, not just for him, but for everyone watching. He arrived at the courthouse early. The building felt colder than before, more sterile, but Malik's presence brought a certain weight to the space. People greeted him with cautious respect, not overly warm, but intentional. Elena arrived and took a seat in the gallery, along with the Pattersons and a few community members who had followed the case since the beginning. Karen was brought in last, her face expressionless, her body stiff. She didn't look around the room. She sat beside her lawyer and waited, like someone watching her own life from behind glass. The judge entered, and the room stood. Then everyone sat again, and the moment began. The charges were read one by one, the room holding its breath with each line. And then came the verdict, guilty on all counts. Fraud, identity theft, obstruction, unlawful occupancy, and false reporting. A murmur moved through the courtroom, not loud, but definite. Karen remained still. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she didn't react. She looked at the floor, unmoved, like the weight of the decision hadn't yet reached her. The judge began to speak, not just issuing the verdict, but delivering a statement. He addressed the court about the dangers of systemic abuse, about how this case revealed the cracks in legal and social structures that allow people to weaponize identity and perception. He thanked Malik by name for his composure, for his commitment to truth, for the dignity he maintained under pressure. And then, before issuing the sentencing, he said something that lingered with everyone present. This case was not just about fraud. It was about accountability. And accountability doesn't stop here. It belongs to all of us. In the ways we judge. In the ways we speak. In the ways we choose to act, or not act, when we see injustice. Karen was sentenced to 6 years, with eligibility for parole after 3. It wasn't the maximum, but it was enough to confirm that her actions would not be forgotten or dismissed. She was led out of the room in silence, hands cuffed behind her back. She didn't look back. Malik didn't need her to. After the courtroom emptied, Renee approached him. "You did it," she said, her voice both relieved and proud. Malik gave a tired smile. "We all did. You believed me. That made all the difference." She touched his arm gently. "I didn't believe you because I wanted to. I believed you because the truth was there. You just made sure no one could look away from it." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras ready, microphones poised. Malik stepped forward slowly, Elena at his side, unsure if he would speak. He looked at the crowd and then down at the steps beneath his feet. He could walk away. Let the verdict speak for itself. But something inside told him this moment mattered. He turned to the cameras and spoke. "I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to change the lock on my front door. But what happened after that forced me to see how fragile safety is for people who look like me. It showed me how quickly perception becomes punishment. And how silence makes that punishment possible. What we saw in court wasn't just about one woman, it was about all the ways we let people like her believe they can act without consequence. Today, that belief was challenged. But tomorrow, we all have to decide what we do with the space that's been created." He didn't take questions. He didn't wait for applause. He turned and walked away, the cameras flashing behind him, but his eyes fixed forward. That night, back in Eastbrook, the sky opened up with a quiet rain. Malik sat on his porch again, listening to the soft patter on the roof. The neighborhood was quiet. No police cars. No gossiping neighbors. Just stillness. Elena stopped by, no umbrella, just a hoodie pulled over her head. She sat beside him, their legs brushing slightly, and said nothing at first. Then she turned to him and whispered, "You changed everything." Malik shook his head slowly. "I just told the truth." "That's exactly what I mean," she said, her voice cracking slightly. They sat there, watching the streetlights flicker in the rain, not needing to say anything more. Because everything had already been said. But nothing would ever be the same again. Months passed, and the verdict that once echoed through every corner of Eastbrook began to fade into the steady rhythm of everyday life. But for those who lived through it, who bore witness to the unraveling of lies and the restoration of truth, nothing had returned to what it was. The silence in the neighborhood had transformed, not the silence of avoidance, but the quiet that follows after a storm, when everything broken has been exposed and the work of rebuilding begins. Malik walked those streets with a new kind of presence. He was no longer the man who had to prove he belonged. He was the neighborhood now, not because he fought for it, but because he reminded it of its own reflection, and dared it to change. Karen remained behind bars, but not in the way anyone had expected. In prison, her name meant little. She was no longer the gatekeeper of Eastbrook, no longer a woman whose voice could manipulate law or perception. She was inmate number 048-2937, and behind those walls, stripped of her power and the comfort of illusion, she was forced to confront a reality she had spent years denying. Reports from the court-appointed psychologist later revealed something telling: Karen had not simply committed crimes for profit. She had built a life out of control. Every house she occupied, every false report she filed, every social interaction she orchestrated was part of a compulsive need to assert dominance in spaces where she feared irrelevance. And when that control was taken away, she fractured. There was no redemption arc for her. Only the slow, painful awareness that her empire had been made of paper, and it had burned to the ground under the weight of a truth she could no longer suppress. The trial led to a chain reaction far beyond what anyone anticipated. Local representatives, moved by the attention the case had garnered, introduced legislation aimed at increasing the consequences for false emergency calls rooted in discrimination. Policies around squatting laws and property verification were revisited, and new oversight committees were formed to protect tenants and homeowners from identity fraud. Malik was asked to sit on one of those committees, not as a token voice, but as a respected figure who had seen firsthand the cracks in the system and had the clarity to help seal them. He accepted, not for the title, but for the chance to turn his personal pain into public purpose. Meanwhile, Elena, who had stood by him without ever asking for recognition, found her voice growing in the community too. Her blog, once dedicated to local arts and neighborhood news, transformed into a platform for accountability. She wrote about the silent courage of doing the right thing when it's uncomfortable, about allyship that doesn't center itself, and about the subtle ways communities learn to protect power under the mask of order. Her words spread beyond Eastbrook, getting picked up by national outlets, earning her a reputation not as a reporter, but as a chronicler of truth. And as for Malik, his life bloomed in quiet, powerful ways. He expanded the youth tech program he volunteered at, securing funding to open a physical space downtown where underrepresented kids could learn coding, design, and digital literacy. He called it, the Key Room, a subtle, poetic nod to the moment everything changed, when a lock, and the right to protect it, became the spark for justice. The space became more than a learning center. It became a refuge. A symbol. A living reminder that ownership isn't about land or doors, it's about identity, security, and the right to exist without apology. One evening, standing in that space after the last group of teens had gone home, Malik looked around at the rows of computers, the walls lined with artwork from the kids, and the quiet hum of servers running in the background. He wasn't alone. Elena stood beside him, holding a warm cup of tea, both of them bathed in the soft light overhead. She turned to him and said, "It's wild, isn't it? How something meant to break you ended up building all of this." Malik smiled, not the weary kind of smile that hides pain, but a full, peaceful one. "It didn't build it," he replied. "I did. The pain just showed me where the foundation needed to be." The world didn't suddenly become safe overnight. People still whispered. Bias still found its way into rooms and policies and stares. But Malik no longer carried the burden of proving his humanity. That weight had lifted, not because of revenge, but because of resolution. He had faced the worst kind of erasure, and he answered with presence. He had been targeted by a woman who believed the system would protect her, and instead, he used that same system, flawed as it was, to dismantle her illusion and rewrite the outcome. And now, to you, who have listened to this story from the very beginning, who have walked through each moment, each decision, each injustice and triumph, I want to ask you something. How many times have you looked away because it was easier? How often have you seen someone treated unfairly and told yourself it wasn't your place to step in? How often have you believed someone's version of a story because they looked like the people who usually get believed? This story is about Malik. But it's also about us. About every system we participate in, every silence we uphold, every truth we hesitate to say out loud because we're afraid of the cost. But what's the cost of staying silent? What is the price of letting people like Karen keep walking through the world unchecked, rewriting narratives with every word, every lie, every false report? Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in conversations. In reflection. In resistance to the comfortable lies we're taught to accept as normal. So if this story moved you, if it made you pause, if it made you think differently about who gets to feel safe and why, don't let it stop here. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share what part of this story hit you the hardest. Reflect on how you've seen this play out in your own life or community. And most importantly, ask yourself what you would have done if you were in Malik's shoes, or Elena's, or the neighbors who had to decide whether to watch or act. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe in truth, twists, and the power of voices that often go unheard, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the world doesn't change through headlines. It changes through the stories we choose to listen to, and the courage it takes to carry them with us.